safe in your hands, God. Lord, we just pray that you watch over us this coming week, Lord, that you would take this message and let it be yours and our life, God, that we could be the people that you want us to be. Just be with those who are not able to be here, Lord, that you would just give them what they need and those that are sick and hurt. In your name we pray. Amen. Now, most of us are familiar with what a house looks like. And to have a house, you need some materials. You need some bricks, maybe, some wood, maybe a good concrete foundation. But there's also this really great thing that you need in a house. If you want it to be a home, you need some people. You need some people in your house. And the reality is that you and I could go all the way across America and the world and look at all kinds of houses where people belong. You can go to a trailer park. You can go to a middle-class subdivision. You can go to like a really upper-class place where they have these huge, massive mansions. But the crazy thing is that just because it's a nice house doesn't mean it's a place that you want to be. The people on the inside, it makes all the difference. And one of the things that really makes a difference is that we want to find a place where we can belong, where we can be safe, where we can feel like that we can be ourselves. And one of the biggest ingredients that we need in our lives in order to belong, in order to find a place that we can call our own, is it has to be a place where our voice is heard. How many of you have ever had an opinion? I know you do, like I have them all the time. But how many of you have had an opinion and you want to speak up? You want to tell people how you feel? How does it feel when they don't listen to you? Right? It's all good till you say what you feel like you need to say and they don't listen, right? And in your heart, it doesn't matter if they're the best people in the world, if it's in the greatest place and you have everything in common. Once it gets to that point to where you feel like your voice is not heard, guess what happens? You and I, we begin to disconnect from those people, right? Because we say, well, they just really don't care about me. I continually try to tell them how I feel, what I want to do, and they don't listen. And oftentimes in life, we start out pretty good. Most of us have this blueprint of our life on how we want it to go. We already know what our kids are going to turn out like. We dress them, tell them you're never going to do anything really bad because then it's going to come off on me. We have a plan to have good health. Like nobody plans on dying. Nobody wants to do that, go through cancer, go through a horrible sickness or illness. And oftentimes we have a desire to be good. How many of y'all really just get up in the morning and say, I would love to do some wicked stuff today? You want to tell you a secret? Not even wicked people do that. Like they're fools. And so we have this dream of having a good health, good life, be at a place where someone hears us. And so we have this life, and it's great at first, but then life has this magical way of taking what we wanted to be like and then turning it into something that we don't want to be, in a place that we don't want to be. For example, our health starts out good. Like when you're born, you're a baby. I mean, it's great. You grow up, right? But then all of a sudden, you go to that doctor's appointment, or maybe you take too much fried food. I don't know, whatever it is. All of a sudden, you start having some heart problems. You start having some health problems, and so your life is filled with just a little bit of this bitterness here. And then you have people in your life that you love to death. And you know what those people do? They betray you. They lie to you. Just treat you horrible. And so then your life gets filled up with a little more bitterness, a little more problems. And then you have these kids. They're wonderful. They're beautiful. You show everybody every picture you've ever had of them. But then one day, they do something that you just would like to take every picture that you ever had of them and hide it from people. And so you get a little more bitterness because when you go out in public, you know that all your church friends and everybody else are looking at you and saying, oh, they're a horrible parent. How could they let their children do something like that? And so the list goes on and on and on. And so we get filled with this sorrow and we get filled with this depression. And we know that we believe in God. We know that we believe in God, but we really ask the question, is he even listening to us? Does God even care? Because if God cared, what would he do? He would help us, right? Like, he would heal us. He would give us our relationships fixed. He would give us joy in the midst of our suffering. But for some reason, that one area of our life, it continues and it continues and continues. And it doesn't get better. So how can you and I say that we're good with God when he doesn't do anything? Right? And here's the reality. Oftentimes, when we look at our opinion of people, it's one thing for someone to do nothing, to tell them our issues, to pour out your heart and just be real with them about what's going on. It's one thing for them to do nothing, but our opinion of that person goes completely higher up when we realize that they are actually trying to help us to do something. And so this morning, we're going to look at the life of Moses. And if you would turn with me to Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, we find that even when we can't see what God is doing, we can know that God is offering us salvation, that he is helping us a way out, and that the number one myth that we have to refuse to believe is that God is doing nothing, because he's doing something, but oftentimes we can't see that. And so if you look with me in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, it says, now a man from the family of Levi married a Levite woman. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch. She placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Whew, okay. But so anyway, we find that this is the story of a child named Moses. And it's very important to point out here is that last week we talked about Joseph. And Joseph was like this cultural hero. And everybody in Egypt after that, they would say, oh, these Israelites are great people because Joseph saved Egypt from famine, from dying. But then one day, guess what happens? Everybody forgets about Joseph. And so new Pharaoh comes into town. And if you're familiar with when new people come into town, like a new CEO comes into a company, a new leader of an organization, what happens? They say, well, why you do this way? Why is this any good? And that's what happened when they got a new Pharaoh that did not know anything about Joseph, didn't remember Joseph. So he looked at all these Israelites, and you know what he began to think about? He began to get very afraid because he looked at how many Egyptians there were and how many Israelites there were. And he realized that Israel could destroy Egypt, that they were strong in numbers. So what do you do when people do this? You got to get rid of them. You got to get rid of them. And it's really hard to fight big, strong men, okay? And so the Egyptian Pharaoh comes up with his plan. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to destroy all the newborn baby boys. And so he instructed his midwives to destroy them at birth, but they didn't listen. So then he gave them a second commandment. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to find a newborn baby Israelite, and I want you to throw him into the Nile River. And so time after time, Pharaoh is trying to destroy Israel. And so it brings us to this point in the story where we have a man from the family of Levi married this Levite woman, and they had a child together. And you know what that child looked like? It was beautiful. It was beautiful. Like, some babies are prettier than other babies. Like, we all think our babies is the most prettiest. But I'm telling you, some babies are more beautiful than other babies. And old Moses, he was a pretty baby. But we have a strange situation here, because here's what this sentence says. It says, man, beautiful child. And then she hid it. You know what you do with a beautiful baby? You show it off. I mean, you got, 2x4-inch photographs in your wallet. You got them on your refrigerator. Maybe you make some for the whole Sunday school class. Next family gathering. Send them, mail it out to every person in your family, so they know your child is the most beautiful. That's how it works. But this is not what happened. They find this beautiful child, he's born, and then they hide Moses. And the reason they hide Moses is because there is this situation here that it does not matter how beautiful you are as a baby. If you are of Israelite descent, you're going to die. They don't want you around. And so we find that put them in this basket, and makes this basket with papyrus and puts them by the riverbank. And something very important to know here is that this Moses was from the tribe of Levi. And see, before Israel became this big old great nation, and you had sacrifices, you had all this stuff, before any of that, God ordained that the tribe of Levi would be the spiritual leaders of the country. Now, here's the amazing part of this. God planned this out even before any of it ever existed. Like, Moses was pretty much going to be the spiritual leader of the nation of Israel. He was the one they was going to look to and say, where do we go, Moses? And Moses was going to say, look, this is what God says we need to do. Now, luckily, God knew that he wanted the tribe of Levi to do this, so he chooses Moses to have these qualifications of being in the tribe of the Levites. And so it should give us some comfort that sometimes we feel like that we have to handle all of our problems. We feel like that we have to be qualified, right? Like, you go in for a job interview, you really do need qualifications. Like, it doesn't matter how good you can talk, how good any of that. Like, it's good to have qualifications. And so oftentimes, what we have to understand about this scripture is, do you know how many other Israelite babies there were? A lot. Like, I'm talking tons, millions. And here's the thing. What do you think their family was thinking about? Right? So you have been in slavery for all these years. They would end up being in slavery for 400 years. You know how long 400 years is? I mean, that's a long time. Like, when God doesn't answer us in a week, you know what we say? Oh, don't think he's there. Like, look, all these Israelite people was in their huts on their knees asking God to help them, to save them, and then they would have to get up the next day and go be a slave again. And then this decree comes that not only is God taking their freedom and God taking all, or Egypt taking all this, but now their children are going to be taken away from them. Like, how many of you, if you have children, you don't have to raise your hand, but do you like them? Yeah, I mean, you don't have to raise your hand. But, hey,
You like them. It doesn't matter what they do. Doesn't matter. You love them to death. And so this kind of looks like God does not care. It really does. Like as Christians, we would say, oh, no, 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 God cares. But looking from the outside, you see his people being slaves and their family being threatened. And the thing is that all over Egypt, where these Israelites lived, this was the process. Pray for God to rescue us, get up, be a slave every day. And they thought that God wasn't doing anything. I mean, that's most likely what they thought. You probably had they had some faith. But for the most part, if you was to look at the circumstances in the scene, you know what you would think? God is not doing anything. But the reality is that God was doing something great. The problem was you couldn't see it. You couldn't see it. And as people, we are fans of sight. We like to see things. We like to be able to see a process of what is happening here. And so oftentimes when we have this bitterness in our life, when life is just not like we feel like it should be, and we have been praying and we've been kneeling and we have asked God so many different ways, we get frustrated. We get mad. And most of us in here, we would never say that we're just mad at Jesus because, Jesus died for us and all that, right? But I guarantee you, everybody in this room has been mad at Jesus because we're like, Jesus, why don't you listen to me? Why don't you listen? And the reason that we're angry is because we don't see him doing anything. We don't see any action. We don't see nothing changing. And what we have to realize in life is that if we want to save ourselves a lot of trouble, we get frustrated because we look at the problems in our life and then we see that God ain't fixing them. And we see that we don't have what it takes, right? Because how many of us in here are, this great famous doctor or surgeon? Probably not. How many of us in here are some kind of, professional relationship coach and knows how to deal with relationships? None of us, right? How many of us in here is able to forgive sin? Nobody. So what you have is we have a problem with our qualifications. We do not have what it takes to answer what we're asking God to do. That's kind of the situation. And so when we do that, oftentimes we get ideas. You ever get ideas? I get ideas all the time, right? And so what you do is that you take these problems in your life here, and you've tried the Jesus way. Tried it, right? Like you went to church, you prayed, you read extra devotion, maybe, maybe you talked to your pastor or someone else, and so but then, guess what? It's still there. It's still there. So you know what you have to do now is that you have to take God's job. That's what you got to do, right? And so what happens is, instead of working with what God is doing that we can't see, oftentimes we take our own lives and we've already established that we are not qualified. And you know what happens when unqualified people try to do stuff? It messes things up. It does not produce lasting change, okay? So then maybe we say, you know what, Jesus ain't working for me. So I think I will try to find joy in something else, and I will try to get rid of this bitterness here. And then we say, well, that didn't work. Like I ate a Little Debbie, I talked to the best pastor in West Monroe. I did all this kind of stuff, and it just didn't work. So all I need to do now is I need to do what every good person does when Jesus ain't doing his job. All I got to do now is I have to Google it, right? Google it. That's what everybody does. Google it and see what the people of the internet say. Right? I mean, because there's people out there, they going through the same stuff as you and me. They are. And they have solutions also. So then try their solution. Try a little bit of their solution. And so we begin to try to just get rid of this depression and problems in our life with our own qualifications. And let me tell you, what happens there is that for a small time, see, it's okay. It's okay. But the problem is, it doesn't get the heart of the issue. If you notice here, it's still in there. It's in the same situation, the same color. Nothing has changed. And so, whatever it is you and I are dealing with, there is a big chance that we feel frustrated and we feel aggravated because we've asked God to do it and it doesn't seem like He's doing anything, and we don't have what it takes to fix that problem, so it just makes us madder and madder and madder, and then we try to do it anyway, and we discover what we already know, which is we can't fix it, and then when we try to fix it, guess what happens? It just makes it worse. It just makes it worse. And so you and I have to ask ourselves, how have we been handling these situations in our life to where we feel like God is not doing anything? How have we been doing it? Have we been trying to handle it with our own qualifications and our own abilities and our own power? And when we try to do that, I mean, it can get very rough. And so what we have to do is we have to trust someone who's qualified. But the thing about God is that oftentimes He doesn't work like, if you've ever been to one of these really nice donut places where you can see how the donuts are made. You ever been there? And you sit there and you watch them. And you watch them go, go, go. That is how we would prefer for God to work in our lives. For us to sit back and to know like God is doing something. And the good news about God is that, see, He doesn't just fix things superficially like us. God fixes things, but the thing about God's solution is that sometimes even when He's working, you know what it looks like? It looks like nothing. Nothing at all. Like nothing's going on. But when in reality, God is doing great things. But we just can't see it. And so this morning, I just ask you, whatever that one thing is in your life that you struggle with, that you're dealing with, to ask yourself the question, do you want to continue to try to make something happen on your own merit, on your own abilities, on your own power? Or are you going to try to trust that God can actually do something with it? And the good news is when you put God in charge, guess what happens? You're no longer in charge. And everybody wants to be in charge, but the problem is when you're in charge, if it fails, guess whose fault it is? It's yours. And how many of us like it when everything falls apart and it's our fault? Nobody. But that is the story of what sin is. And so as we look at this situation, everybody thought, well, God doesn't care. He doesn't hear me, and He's not doing anything. But God was doing the exact opposite. And you may say, well, why didn't He just bring in some heaven angels, go down there and just break them free? Well, probably because God knows Israel. And they were a finicky people. And they were a people that sometimes they listen. And so if you think about it, God knew the perfect plan. Because He took a person out of their own people, out of their own flesh and blood, so that when it came time for that day for their rescue, Moses could say, look, I am flesh of your flesh, I'm blood of your blood, and God knew that perfect way. So then we see that his mother puts him in this papyrus basket. Now, if you love your children, you protect them. But how crazy would it be that if you had a newborn child you made a nice little waterproof, basket for it, and you put it on the banks of the Washita River and just left it there, hoping maybe some professional bass fisherman is going to pick it up and it'll have a great life. That would be crazy, right? Why? Because newborn babies, they're not very defensive. They have no defense system. And the culture in this village of the Israelites, I mean, they were scared. Like, imagine if at any moment someone could come in your house and take your baby and throw them in the Nile River. You know how scared that would be? So obviously they had people watching out. And some people think that they had this basket in the banks of the river, and then when they heard the Egyptians were coming, they would put old Moses down in there. And so Moses is being protected. His mother, and it's very important to realize that Moses' mother only did this after she had done all she could do. And you know how hard it is to hide a baby? I mean, they're small, right? So what's the problem? They are so loud. Like any little thing, cry, 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 cry. And so Moses' mother had to hide this child in the Nile, on the banks. And so what does the Bible say here? It says, but when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch. She placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Then his sister stood at a distance in order to see what would happen to him. And this sounds just like a sister, doesn't it? She's going to watch back. I'm going to see what happens to old baby brother here. And so she was protecting her baby brother. And so then what happens next? No one could have imagined. And no one could have ever predicted. It says, Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe at the Nile while her servant girls walked along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds, sent her slave girl, took it, opened it, and saw him, the child, and there he was, a little boy crying. She felt sorry for him and said, this is one of the Hebrew boys. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, should I go and call a Hebrew woman who is nursing to nurse the boy for you? And so we find that Moses was hidden, and he was hidden on the bank of the Nile River. Now, the amazing thing about this is that the Nile River is a big river. A big river. And Pharaoh's daughter comes down there to take a bath. And what are the odds that Pharaoh's daughter would go bathe in the exact spot that little Moses had been laid to rest in this little basket here? There's only God odds. That's what you call God odds. Like, that's the only way it's possible. That's it. That's it. And so Pharaoh's daughter comes down here, and then, maybe she heard little Moses crying, something going on, and they get this basket, and they're like, wow, this is a baby. Now, this is important to realize that she was an Egyptian. She was the daughter of the man that made this horrible rule. And you would think that a Pharaoh finding it was a bad idea. But this woman had mercy on Moses. She had mercy. She said, look, it's a little Hebrew crying. And you know what? I bet she even thought he was beautiful too. She said, man, look at this beautiful baby. And just like any woman in the whole world, she couldn't let this baby go away and die and die in the Nile. She couldn't do that. And the thing is, God orchestrated these circumstances for the salvation of Israel. Now, did they know about this? Did they have a newspaper that went out to every Israelite and said, look, baby Moses has been found by Egyptian Pharaoh's daughter. We are going to be saved when he grows up and becomes a strong man. There was no news headlines. There was no newsletter. There was no notification. There was nothing. Silence. And so everywhere else is like silence from God. But yet, where was God? He was completely right in the middle of it. And oftentimes we look at the circumstances that we have in our life. And sometimes, just like our qualifications, they're not good. Like, it doesn't match up that we're going to get out of this alive, that there's going to be hope, that we're going to have a second chance, whether that's because something really bad's happened, and then we've asked God to do something, and when he didn't do something, we did something. And when we did something, guess what we got? Really bad circumstances. And we experienced pain and suffering and loss. And so we have to realize that it's okay that we're not qualified. And it's okay that our circumstances are not good. Because God can use even the worst of circumstances for his good. That he can fill in the blanks. That he can produce a life where there is none. And so, as we examine and ask ourselves the question, does God care? Is God doing something about it? We have to realize that it's okay that our circumstances are not what we need. And the reason that we can be okay with that is because, see, God is in charge of everything. And that means he can take something over here, and he can bring it over here. And he can take something over here, and he can put it right here. And so if we don't have the correct circumstances, just like if you think about the Israelite camp, how many babies there were, how many mothers tried to hide their child, how many mothers had sorrow when their child was taken from them. There was a lot of circumstances that were horrible, that were not good, and they thought that God was not there for them. But there was one circumstance that was right. And it was a circumstance that would not just save one baby, but it would free them from slavery and pain and suffering for the rest of their life. And so the good news today is that if you don't have the right circumstances and everything's not how you need it to be for God to do something, that's okay. Do you know how much stress that should take off your shoulders? Like when you know you don't have to be qualified and the circumstances don't have to be right. But next we see that sister pops up. And she asks this question. She says, then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, should I go and call a Hebrew woman who is nursing to nurse the boy for you? Go, Pharaoh's daughter told her. So the girl went and called the boy's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages. Did you hear that? You are going to get paid for what you already spoke, you're already going to do. Like people normally don't get paid for this, especially back then. And when God's plan happened, something nobody could, better than anybody could ever imagine happened. And so Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages. So the woman took the boy and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. And so this would almost be like someone paying you a lot of money just to stay home and take care of your kids. Like, that's pretty much what it boils down to. Like something that she loved and she was already doing and didn't cost her nothing, she was going to get paid for and taken care of. That is the customer service of God. When we follow him, when we trust him, when we take our hands off and do what only we can do and let God do what only he can do, see, we have this amazing result that produces wonderful, wonderful changes. And so a baby who should be dead lives in the palace of Egypt. with the ethnicity that was trying to be destroyed. And the reality is that you hear about Moses' life, and he did a lot of great things, but you can only do great things if you're alive. You know how many dead people do great things? Not very many of them. They just don't do anything. And the reality is that, see, Moses would have never saved Egypt. I mean, never saved Israel, never brought them out of slavery, never took care of them in the middle of the desert, never got between them and God when they were jerks to God and didn't do what they were supposed to. None of that, bring them to the promised land, none of that would have happened if God had not done this. If Moses' mother, if his sister, if his family had not taken care of Moses. And the reality is that a lot of things that God did in Israel otherwise were very public, were very out there. Like when you read, you probably read about the splitting of the Red Sea. That's something you can't miss. Like splitting of the Red Sea, plagues on Egypt, all this stuff. That is big, that is amazing, and it is. But the reality is that in this moment where Israel was still under slavery, where their children were in danger, it was no different. God was still with them at that point, just like he was then thereafter. The only difference was that most of them could not see it. And you and I, we like to be fortune tellers. We like to be fortune tellers. And we like to look at our qualifications, and we like to look at our circumstances, and we put those two things together, and then we add the God thing where we say, well, I tried. Like I prayed, I've sweated. Like I even went so far as to fast a little bit. Like I didn't eat lunch one day. Like we go all the way, and God doesn't do nothing. So, and we can't see it. And so we put all these things together, and here's what we say. We predict failure. We predict God is not going to help us. We predict that there's no hope. And what we have to understand is that God is not limited by our qualifications, and he's not limited by our circumstances, and he is the one who is going to give us the ending. He is the one who is going to give us that hope. And the reality is that most of the time that we haven't seen God work greatly in our life, it's not God's fault. Like we have just made a decision to look at what we have in our limited supply and say, well, that's it. That's it. And so whatever it is that you and I have prayed about, that we have asked God about, that we have just worked so hard to try to make it happen, and we can't control it and we can't do anything about it, whatever that is, we have to come to this understanding and this realization that God can work with what we have. He can work with what we have. That we may not see it, you can't see it. That's the problem. That's really where the anger issues come in. So, what do you do when you can't see God doing anything? What you and I basically need is we need a down payment. Now, we need a down payment on this future joy. And we need proof of God's character. And the reality is that if we go all the way back and we focus on this one truth, right, that we are horrible people, okay? Here's the secret. Nobody in life is good. So this week or next week when you hear about somebody in the Christian world who's done something wrong, don't have a heart attack, okay? Because people do stuff wrong, even good people. And so we are sinners, and God did not say, that's your problem. He didn't do that. But we're over here, God's over here, and we're way over here. And God actually created this bridge by killing his son on a cross, like telling his son to come down to earth and die on a cross and rise again the third day. And so essentially, what that means is that if we desire that, then we are forgiven. We are forgiven. We are free. We have hope. We have all this mercy, and we have a home in heaven. And so if God did not spare his son for our salvation, why would he do nothing about anything else? And the reality is that if he didn't spare his own son, guess what? There is nothing more valuable than that. And we can try to manipulate our lives and maybe read some more, pray some more, talk to people who know what they're talking about. We can try to find joy in all these places. But if we try to do that on our own, see, our bitterness and our depression and our anger is still going to be there. And in fact, we are going to be more messed up than we were in the beginning. And what we have to realize is what God does is God actually changes things. Now, the problem is he don't change things before our eyes sometimes, but he changes the content, right? He changes the makeup of it. And when it's all over and said and done, you know what we say? Well, man, God is so great. I had faith in him the whole time. Like, I'm never going to worry my whole life ever again. Never going to do that, because I know if God did this, he can do anything else. And sadly, we don't take that approach a lot of times. Next time our cup gets filled up with bitterness and failure, we're like, whoa, this is different. But it's really not. So as we have this invitation and the music plays, I challenge us to just go before God with this burden, whatever burden that we have is on our hearts, that we've been trying to get God to do something about. And to be encouraged that just because God hasn't done anything and there's no visible sign, to realize that God loves us very much, that he's working for us, and that even though you and I are not qualified, even though we don't have the right circumstances, that he is going to bring a great ending out of it that only he can accomplish.